So in this screencast, we're going to move on from looking at Milgram's study of obedience, and we're going to move forward to looking at explanations for obedience. So just as a recap, what do we mean by obedience? So obedience is following orders given by a person in authority, aka doing what you're told by someone of a higher authority. So variations on Milgram's original procedure. So you can see on the top kind of bar that you've got was his standard procedure. That's covered in the previous screencast. If you need to go back and revisit that, please do. Other variations that we're going to have a look at during the lesson. So first one being that the victim is silent throughout the entire procedure. They never scream, they never protest. Remember, in the standard procedure, Mr. Wallace, around 300 volts, started screaming, shouting, protesting, talking about his heart problem. So that obviously affected the results. This is varied in the first variation. So in that first variation, he never screams, he never protests. Think about what that might do to the obedience rate. Second variation, the study is carried out in a rundown office block instead of Yale University. Bearing in mind Yale University, very prestigious, very well respected. Think about what that's going to do to the obedience rate if it's now run in a kind of shabby rundown office block. Third variation, the learner is placed in the same room as the teacher, so they're no longer in separate rooms, they no longer have a screen between them. The learner's right there in the same room as the teacher, so the teacher can see exactly what impact their actions are having. Again, think about what that's going to do to the obedience rate. Fourth variation, the teacher forces the learner's hand onto a shock plate, so instead of the learner just being kind of automatically shocked, the teacher actually has to press their hand down onto a shock plate, taking more responsibility. Again, think about what that will do to the obedience rate. Fifth one, experimenters not present in the room but phones through the orders into the teacher, so they're not side by side with the teacher giving them those verbal prods, i.e. the experiment requires you to continue, you must continue. They're in another room and they will phone through the orders through to the teacher. Again, think about what that will do to the obedience level. And last but not least, the teacher is paired with two other Confederate teachers and they refuse to obey. They sit there and say, I'm not going to carry on, I'm leaving, I'm off. And again, think about what that will do to the obedience rate. We will go through these in lesson, so if you can have a think about before the lesson, do you think the obedience rate goes up or do you think the obedience rate goes down? Second thing we'll have a look at in the lesson, so explanations for obedience. Two different types of explanations we're going to have a look at. First of all, situational factors, and second of all, personality or dispositional factors. So the various situational factors we will study are legitimacy of authority, and that is affected by the location, and it's also affected by the uniform that the person's wearing who's giving the orders. Also, proximity of authority figure. Now, proximity means closeness. So how close is that authority figure to the person who's meant to be following the instructions? Second of all, as I mentioned, dispositional or personality factors. We will look at the authoritarian personality. So, first explanation is legitimacy of authority. So a person is more likely to obey when they believe that the person giving orders has authority over them. And the authority might come from the fact that they've worn a uniform. So, for example, a guard, a policeman, a ticket inspector, their uniforms give them authority. And also the location of exchange is equally important. So does it happen on the street, on the train, in the workplace? For example, it might be said that a nurse's uniform gives them more authority in a hospital than it does on a train. Now, you've got a number of pieces of research to support this explanation. First of all, you have the Bickman study. So the guards were more obeyed than the civilian, and this is because their uniform gave them legitimate authority. You've also got the Milgram study. So you're using the experimenter's coat condition versus the normal clothing condition. When the researcher wore normal clothing in comparison to an experimenter's coat, the obedience rate was reduced. So they obeyed less the kind of normal clothing than when Milgram was dressed in the experimenter's coat, giving him more authority. And finally, Milgram's other variation, whereby he was much more obeyed when he was conducting this study at Yale University in comparison to the shabby office. So on the left, you've got location, as I've said, Yale University versus the shabby office. Think about the difference between the two. And also uniform. So I've given you a picture there of policemen and women who their uniform displays their authority. Just to talk to you a little bit more about uniform. So a person's more likely to obey when the person giving orders is wearing a uniform. Any uniform seems to have an impact. So as we saw in Bickman's study, the milkman's uniform, the milkman was more obeyed than the civilian. However, some uniforms do hold a higher status. So a security guard or a policeman would hold much more status than a milkman. And research to support this particular explanation, well, you've got Bickman when you're comparing the guard's uniform versus the milkman's uniform versus the civilian's uniform. As we know, the guard and the milkman were more obeyed than the civilian. However, the guard was the most obeyed. Second piece of research to support, so Milgram study, again, you've got the experimenter's coat versus the normal clothing conditions, and as we know, the experimenter, when he was wearing the lab coat, he was much more obeyed than when he was wearing normal clothing. Finally, to talk to you about the location explanation. So a person is much more likely to obey when the location in which the exchange takes place gives the person status. So for example, a ticket collector on a train would have more status than a civilian. And as I've said before, a nurse in the outside world doesn't have as much authority as he does in the hospital. And research to support this explanation, you've got Milgram looking at Yale University versus the shabby office again. Finally, proximity of the authority figure. So a person is much more likely to obey when the authority figure is closer, preferably in the same room. For example, if I was to stand next to you, chances are you'd probably be much more hardworking and less chatty than if I was stood across the room. Equally, if I left the room, probably conversations are going to start and you're not going to obey my instructions of get on with your work. What if a teacher phoned through instructions? Chances are probably you're even less likely to obey and you go off topic. Research to support this, you've got the research variation by Milgram. So comparing the two conditions where the researcher is in the room versus when they're phoning through instructions. So we've gone through situational factors. As I've said, location and uniform are, they kind of come under the legitimacy of authority explanation. However, they can also be used as their own separate explanations. I've also gone through proximity of authority figure with you. Moving on to dispositional factors, which we're going to look at the authoritarian personality. So final explanation, the authoritarian personality. So a person is more likely to obey when they have an authoritarian personality. Someone would develop an authoritarian personality if they were raised in a very strict household and that strict household had traditional values. This leads people with an authoritarian personality to believe that hierarchy is key. Hierarchy is really, really vital. So in terms of hierarchy, they would obey and they would respect people they believe of higher status. They wouldn't obey someone they believe is lower status. So for them, in their mind, that hierarchy, that idea of status is really, really important. Now, research to support this comes from Elms and Milgram. So Milgram teamed up with Elms and they replicated Milgram's study. So they used that shock setup to see whether people with a higher score on the F scale were more likely to obey. Now, the F scale stands for fascist scale, and that measures how authoritarian that person is. So if they score highly on the F scale, they are more authoritarian, and if they score low on the F scale, they are less authoritarian. And they found that there was a correlation between scores on the F scale and obedience, i.e. the people with the higher F scale scores and the people who had the authoritarian personality were more likely to obey. So that's it. We've looked at a few different situational factors and we've looked at one personality, also known as dispositional factor. So before you come to the lesson, can you make sure that you can do the following? Explain the difference between situational and dispositional explanations. Number 2, explain what's meant by legitimacy of authority. Outline each of the explanations for 3 marks each. So legitimacy of authority, location, uniform, dispositional explanations, i.e. authoritarian personality, and then proximity of the authority figure. And finally, link each explanation to obedience. So why does that person obey, or why does that person disobey?